afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for attending our webinar on gene editing implications for the agri-food sector. My name is Serge Buis. I am the CEO of the Agri-Food Innovation Council. Soon you're going to see something else than the blank screen, hopefully, but you should see some of our participants already. But I wanted to thank you and welcoming you to our fourth webinar in our series on the future of agri-food research and innovation in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. I will not be your moderator for this session. Pierre Faubert will be your moderator, and I will get into that in a few seconds. I would also like to thank the following organization for partnering with us for this event: Farm Credit Canada, Agwes Bio, and Osler, Oskin, and Arcourt. In a moment, I will invite our moderator to begin the session. But before we begin the moderated discussion, I have a few technical notes to share. The chat bar will not be active for the attendees, or should not be active for the attendees. That being said, you are more than welcome, and you're encouraged, you're asked to ask your questions using the Q&A button. If you see a question asked by another attendee that you like, you may upvote it in order to move it up the queue, so it will move up in the list of the questions. If you prefer to ask your question verbally, please use the raise hand button next to the Q&A button. Once identified by the moderator, you will be invited to unmute yourself to ask your question. Today's moderator is Pierre Faubert, and I want to thank Pierre for taking on that role. Gene editing is not my specialty. I did science in university, political science, not any other type of science. So it was really good for Pierre to take on this important discussion as the moderator. Pierre is the director acting at Sustainable Protein Production Program at the National Research Council of Canada, and he will moderate the session today. Thank you so much, Pierre. And now I'll hand it back to you and go back to hiding until the end. Thank you.
Okay, merci beaucoup, Serge. So it's a pleasure for me to have the opportunity to moderate today. As many of you will know, that in March of this year, Health Canada declared that gene-edited plants were as safe as their conventional counterparts. And with this potential to revolutionize the ag-food sector, gene editing technology can enable efficient, precise, and targeted changes to a plant or an animal-specific DNA sequence. This allows for improved resistance to disease, adaptability to climate change, to name just a few examples. Our panelists will discuss the implications of this development. But before we begin the moderated discussion, I invite our panelists today to say a few words about themselves and their organization. So we're extremely pleased to welcome the panel today. And joining us are Ian Affleck from CropLife, and he's the Vice President of Plant Biotechnology there. Ryan Philippe, who's Director of Corporate Development at Genome Canada. Heather Shearer, Policy and Program Manager of the Plant Biosafety Office at Canadian Food Inspection Agency. And Krista Thomas, who's the Vice President, Trade Policy, Seed Innovation at the Canadian Grain Council. So if I can sort of ask the panelists to provide a few more introductory comments, starting with Ian Affleck, please.
Great, thank you very much, Pierre. So yeah, Ian Affleck with CropLife Canada. We're a national trade association representing developers, manufacturers, and distributors of plant science innovations. That includes crop protectants as well as new varieties and seeds. And that's why we work and work in the scientific area that encompasses gene editing as a tool within the plant breeder's toolbox. So excited to be here today to talk about that. Just a little bit of background, I grew up in a seed potato farm, so seed and seed-related issues has been part of my life for a long time, and then went to school studying agronomy. So impacts of new breeding technologies and new techniques has always been something that's been kind of exciting for me as well.
Thank you, Ian. Ryan?
Hello, bonjour, merci for having me here today. So I'm representing Genome Canada as Director of Corporate Development. Genome Canada is a national, federally funded nonprofit organization based in Ottawa. We work as part of a federated ecosystem that incorporates 6 independent regional genome centers. And together we form the Canadian Genomics Enterprise. And we invest in mission-driven research and innovation in genomics and biotechnology with a special emphasis on the ethical, environmental, social, and legal implications of genomics research and implementation in our society. We work across sectors. We leverage federal, provincial, industrial investment to deliver technology and solutions of value to Canadians, including investments in gene editing over many years in the plant and animal sector, expanding into microorganisms and other areas. We're in the early days of the biorevolution. This technology is going to continue to play a big role in accelerating the growth of the bioeconomy in this country. And we're really pleased to be able to provide leadership and national coordination that will enable Canada to really harness the potential of this technology. Personally, I have a background in plant biotechnology, specifically in plant-insect interactions. I work on understanding the evolution of how plants defend themselves against insects so they can't run away from their problems, have all this amazing chemistry. I was then able to work for 10 years to build a startup out of MIT that was essentially producing those plant chemicals via fermentation. So you can't make them via synthesis. They're wonderful, non-sustainable via extraction processes. We can get around that with a biomanufacturing approach. So I'm back in Canada now to help really foster research and innovation as we move towards the bioeconomy.
Thank you very much, Ryan. Heather?
Well, good afternoon. I'm Heather Shearer. I am the Policy Program Manager for CFIA's Plant Biosafety Office, and we deliver pre-market programs for what we call plants with novel traits. And these are plants that have the capacity to impact the environment. And there you go, there's my cat Tully. I was expecting that he might need to be introduced as well. So of course, right now we're working from home, but in more normal times, we are co-located also in a section with CFIA's seed section, which is responsible for variety registration for seed. So we're often a point of contact when it comes to issues around plant breeding and things to do with plant breeding, but we deliver our programs hand in hand with partners in CFIA's Animal Feed Division, which is responsible for pre-market assessment of novel feeds, and also Health Canada's Novel Food section, which I know that we'll be talking about a little bit later today. And as for me, my background is in plant biology, biotech, molecular biology. And I certainly, as you know, although I'm on the regulatory side, do have an interest in all the amazing things technology can accomplish, and what role can we play in helping make sure that those technologies are delivered into the hands of Canadian producers in a way that is safe and sustainable, but also allows us all to benefit from the advances brought by technology. Thank you.
Thank you. So Krista, please.
Thank you, Pierre. Good afternoon, everyone. I don't have a cat with me today, but it's possible you'll hear arguing children in the background from time to time. I'm representing the Canada Grains Council. The CGC is the national umbrella organization for the grain sector. So we have a wide membership spanning seed companies and associations, grower organizations, all of the major grain commodity associations, and grain handlers and exporters. So we work on policy issues that are common across all the representatives of our sector. One of those is plant breeding innovation. And in one sentence, our policy position on plant breeding innovation is that the Canadian ag sector and our growers need access to the most innovative plant varieties to farm profitably and sustainably. At the same time, we need to make sure we are maintaining market access for our exports abroad. Briefly, my personal background is also in plant agriculture. I have a master's in plant agriculture from the University of Guelph. And in another life, I think my career trajectory would have been to become a plant breeder. So this is a very interesting topic for me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I'll start off by asking a question or a few questions, but as Serge indicated earlier, please sort of submit questions. We're encouraging you very much to submit questions through the Q&A button or by raising your hand. So as I indicated earlier, in March in 2021, Health Canada declared that gene editing plants were as safe as their conventional bred counterpart. From March to May, it conducted consultations on its proposed new guidance for novel food regulations on plant breeding. So the question is, what do you think about these recent developments? How should Canada think about incentives, policy, legislation, regulation to ensure product safety, encourage innovation, as well as remain competitive? So I'll start with Mr. Affleck. So Ian, if you would be so kind as to kick off the discussion.
Great. Yeah, thank you. And I think when thinking about Health Canada's recent consultations, as they think about putting forward some revised policies in this space, I think this is a really Government of Canada approach, because as Heather might be able to speak to later, at the CFIA, the feed and environment folks are reviewing their policies and potentially getting ready, and Heather's group is currently undertaking a public consultation as well. So this has been on the agenda for the Government of Canada for a number of years. I think it was in the 2019 Treasury Board regulatory roadmaps. There's been work ongoing to consider what kind of clarity needs to be provided around Canada's system. So I think we're very encouraged to see the government taking this as a priority and moving forward with some clarified guidance that allows plant breeders who may look to utilize gene editing to understand how it fits in the Canadian product-based regulatory landscape. And that's one thing when I come back to plant breeders, because gene editing often gets all of the press. It's the really cool thing to talk about, but our Canadian approach is that it has a potential to impact all plant breeding. It doesn't look at the technique, it looks at what it is that you created. So that makes it a more future-proof system. It's ready for new things to come along. And that means that these consultations are bigger than just gene editing. They're also about conventional breeding, which rarely gets any fanfare. So an example that I've heard used was when a carpenter builds a beautiful home, we don't celebrate the hammer, we celebrate the carpenter. And gene editing is the tool here. And sometimes the plant breeders that are looking to utilize these tools in Canada in order to drive varieties forward, to be more sustainable, to have more benefits on farm, more benefits to the consumer, those are the folks who are really going to benefit from it, whether it's a seed company or a public breeder at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, or a breeder in the university system across the country. So we're really encouraged to see the government moving forward and providing additional guidance in this space. And I think your second question on how should we think about incentives, I might shift, Ryan, when it comes to incentives. I know that your organization looks at the research environment and the ecosystem and how granting systems fit in. So I didn't know if you want to take the first crack at that incentive space and how to create an R&D system here in Canada.
Putting me on the spot there.
I'll follow up.
I mean, at a high level, I think Genome Canada and the Genomic Enterprise in totality is very supportive of the language in the proposed new guidance. I think it really plays to the strength, as Ian alludes to, that it's broader than plants, right? We're moving into a new era of food where sustainability and supply chain stability is central. And so when we expand it to non-traditional food sources coming from microbes or from reactors or from other types of modifications, it's absolutely critical, I think, to be able to embrace the strength of that food first system. And it should, with the right economic and research stimulus, allow us to stay at the forefront in the developments of ag and agri-food. I think we like to emphasize that it's critical for developers to engage early and often with regulatory groups. I think they made that very clear in the language of the proposed new guidance, but it can alleviate a lot of the uncertainty that moves into the process. And engaging earlier into that process at the research side, hopefully in a co-development type of role, would be amenable to accelerating success. So I think that co-development perspective, this sort of feeds to this mission-driven approach that Genome Canada is evolving towards, where moving beyond a sector-specific concept, but into a cross-sectoral, sort of field approach with the right incentives, where we unite the researchers and the users, often from industry as we have in the past, really benefits from an ecosystem-based approach where policy and regulatory is able to inform and co-create the approaches moving forward, so that we're addressing the roadblocks proactively in investing in research, not just to deliver the technology outcome, but to really ensure that the handoffs are coordinated towards implementation of these technologies for society's benefit.
And maybe I might just follow up with that, Ryan, just on the other side of it. I think that lays out the kind of the R&D environment really well. And I think in that question of how should Canada think about it, and I think this is both for industry and government, is that where science and safety is absolutely the beginning, that's the pillar on which anything has to be built. How we should be thinking is both globally and competitively. So it's easy, whether it be industry advertising our country as a place to do R&D, or whether it's through regulation, to look at how other countries are achieving the same safety goals, and are they doing it in a manner that creates a more competitive research environment, a more enticing research environment. So benchmarking ourselves against other countries, looking at what other decisions are being made, and making sure it's a level playing field for research and development in Canada, as well as for access to new varieties to farmers, so that they don't have to wait a number of extra years to get something new here that other producers have access to somewhere else. And maybe the final piece on the Health Canada consultation is the thorough job that they did reviewing the science on gene editing and coming out with, as you mentioned, that statement on gene editing is as safe as conventional breeding when used for those purposes, I think was a really great recognition of the science in that space. And it aligns really well with what we heard from the United States, Japan, a number of regulators in Australia, South America, and even the recent academic reports coming out of the EU from their academic conglomerates, where they're coming out to say the same thing. So we're really excited that Canada is following those regulatory trends and seeing the same thing in the science.
Thank you. So maybe I'll sort of ask Heather to comment. I think between Ian and Ryan sort of commented a few things that I think are relevant here. One of them is maybe the role, the consultation aspect of things, and possibly also the benchmarking against other sort of jurisdictions.
Yeah, happily. So yeah, this is my opportunity to do a plug for our current consultation. It is open now, has been open since May, and we'll be running that until September 16th. So have a look at the CFA's website on our consultations and engagement page. You'll find that consultation along with all of the supporting documents. So we have a few summary pieces, but also the draft policy itself. Please give that a read. We welcome comments. Perspectives from all of our stakeholders are going to be very important to us as we work to finalize some guidance that is as functional as it can be within our framework. So maybe I'll just pivot now to talk a little bit about the framework that we operate under here in Canada. So we've heard a little bit about it, that we do have a very outcome-focused framework. So my group operates under Part 5 of the Seeds regulations. Of course, Health Canada and the Novel Feeds Group operate under the Food and Drugs Act and the Feeds Act, respectively. And ultimately, as well in Canada, we have the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. So the seeds regulations that I operate under are viewed as SEPA equivalent, and that's what allows the pre-market work for seed to be done under the seeds regulations and not be captured by SEPA, which would be the alternative. So our outcome-focused framework really does look at the result at the end of the day. There is no mention in the regulation of the technology used in development. So that's great because it does let us adapt to new technologies as they come around and focus on outcomes that may impact the environment. Flip side of that is that with such a broad focus really that the regulation is set up to capture. Anything that's new, anything that may have an impact, that starts sounding awfully vague. And so that's the role guidance needs to play, is to take that regulation that we work under and translate that into a functional program that draws, you know, an appropriate line of what plants are subject to that regulation, require assessment and authorization, versus which ones qualify for exemption. And that's really what this guidance piece is all about, is trying to define that line and also trying to set it at the right place. So that's a big discussion. It's one that we've been having for a couple of years now with a number of parties, including some of the folks at the table here today. And we'll be continuing to work on nailing that down so that we can get the best piece of guidance out that we can, recognizing that, you know, at the end of the day, it probably won't be perfect. It's not a simple issue, but we do want to get something out that is going to give more clarity to developers and be more functional for them as we, you know, and we can continue to work on that as well as we see the technology roll out. As we expect we will get more questions over the years. Nothing is ever set in stone. I'll stop there.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much. Krista, anything that in the discussion that you wanted to comment? I mean, breeders were brought up in the discussion as well, and the role of conventional breeding. Maybe that was something that piqued my interest. Anything from your perspective?
Yeah, a lot of good comments made already, but I think, you know, I'm just reflecting on, at the end of these consultations and at the end of these processes, how will we know that they've been a success? And I think one of the key measures of that is making sure that our farmers have access to the same types of innovations and the same types of seed that their competitors have in the US or in other countries. And that includes gene-edited varieties. It also includes conventionally bred varieties. I'll just mention briefly that Canadian exports of grain, including oilseeds and pulses, that they add 25 billion annually to the Canadian economy, and we have targets under the Barton Report and the economic strategy tables that are more ambitious. And for us to do our part, the grain sector to do its part in reaching those targets, you know, seed innovation and crop genetics are going to be an important part of that. So it's critically important that our regulations remain science-based and risk-based, but also that we're sure that they're not unnecessarily sort of delaying farmer access to these new innovations. So we were also very pleased to see the proposed direction from Health Canada. It recognizes the safety and the science of gene editing. It helps to align us a little bit more with our trading partners, which is a good thing. And we hope that the CFIA, that both the PBO and the Livestock Feed Division will, at the end of the day, arrive at a similar place.
Okay, thank you. Something that you mentioned there in terms of making sure that the farmers have access to the latest technology, which primes another question that we have on our list, which I'll start and ask initially to Dr. Philippe, which is if you can talk about the state of research and development in Canada as it relates to gene editing. So what are we doing well? What can we do more of? And how do we compare with other countries?
Well, I think where we're doing well, we're doing some, as we've done historically, some great research in a variety of areas, not just the biology, but the supply chain systems that go along with it. We've led some way in some really innovative crop systems, and we've seen some huge potential growth in alternative plant proteins in Canada. We've really led the way with some of those systems. But I think an area where Canada has struggled is to convert the value created from that research into real innovations, and more importantly, to retain those innovations to create value in Canada. Whether it's intellectual property or companies or actual final products. It's a fairly well-known problem that we have struggled to retain that value in Canada, let alone create it and amplify it. So I think a central point is really to capture that value in Canada. So for instance, we export a lot of commodities, but we re-import finished products, right? So there's a need for technologies, also infrastructure, that will allow us to recapture that value. So in the application of the technologies can really move beyond traditional breeding, but can really be deployed in those value addition processes as well. So breeding those plants to improve the potential value capture on the back end, but also those bioprocessing, those bioconversion technologies that will allow us to get to those finished products and sort of stabilize our own supply chain, but also allow us to become an exporter of greater finished goods and create more value for here. The stickiness of the infrastructure, creating jobs, all of these different scenarios come together. But essentially, being able to expand that research with the concept of capturing value, we still need to be able to create more value, more opportunities. And so we see a lot of potential here in what's termed sort of cellular agriculture, but sort of reactor-based animal products, more sustainable animal products, non-dairy milks, these types of scenarios, where there's a lot of potential to really expand into beyond plant and animal, but into microbe and microbiome space. To create novel technologies and novel solutions, not just in the production of plants, but also in how, again, we capture value on the backside. And there's new opportunities, especially with the push towards a net zero environment and that sustainability aspect of how we use our plant systems to promote that. There's the carbon capture components, but as we start to electrify our grid or move away from petroleum, biofuels have always been out there. They've just not been viable. So how can we adapt our technologies and our systems to support that moving ahead? We have an abundance of oil seeds in this country. Can we improve our ability to generate energy from these systems? And moreover, I think the genetic engineering also has potential in terms of allowing us to work with genetically recalcitrant systems. There are certain systems that are very attractive in terms of alternative food as themselves, or as a source of nutrition for these products, but we just can't work with them. We can't modify them. The gene editing aspect allows us to more effectively develop tools that will enable these systems to become novel inputs into our food sources. And beyond that, I think there's the general need for climate adaptation of our crop systems. Adaptation of those systems into new production, for instance, optimizing crops for indoor production. Certain crops grow very well in indoor systems, many don't. Are there opportunities to improve food security and equity of access through being able to produce row crops productively in indoor settings? But I guess at the end of the day, one of the things that would probably benefit most in terms of a research potential would be a strong national strategy for a particular strategic direction. I think we see this when we compare to other countries where, in the Netherlands or in Denmark, these countries punch way above their weight class in terms of ag and agri-food because they've identified strategic opportunities and have made targeted investment to pursue those areas. We have a wealth of carbon resources, clean energy, land. It's almost, we have a surplus of wealth, and so we're spreading ourselves too thin. I think we would benefit immensely from being able to convene the stakeholders in this sector and make some targeted bets that would allow us to, again, bring together those handoffs, right? That value addition, the infrastructure that has to come with that. All of these investments have to be coordinated to realize the value of the research. So I think the conversations happening at the national level on the Pan-Canadian Genomic Strategy will help inform that. But we're also powerhouses in artificial intelligence, and we're investing heavily in quantum computing. The interface between these areas eventually leading towards engineered ecosystems, where, again, in indoor and fermentation, you've got a complete alignment and maximization of the potential of the technology would be very useful.
You might be on mute, Pierre.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I got caught in the old trap. Sorry about that. So any of the panelists want to sort of add on what Ryan was saying? And I think maybe, a lot of sort of thought in terms of the potential in the broad sense of things. Is there anything sort of like whenever we get into the weeds in terms of research that really is a high priority on the crop side of things?
Yeah, I think I might zoom in a little bit. I see, and Krista has something to mention too. I think Ryan set the stage for the science across the board, and I think maybe an example, as Ryan was saying about making those targeted bets, is we have the protein supercluster, which is trying to direct research. I think that's the kind of idea, Ryan, where you're saying like we need those kind of things to make sure we're all pulling on the rope in the same direction. And in the plant agriculture space, kind of how are we doing on the research and development? There's a lot of different ways to measure that. One is looking at international publications, and we're not leading the way right now in the publication of research in the plant side of things. That doesn't mean there isn't research going on, but it's not getting published. And I think with what we're seeing, the priority the government has placed on revising these policies will definitely help create an environment where people are more comfortable to bring that research and investment here. And then hopefully if it can feed into those targeted investment engines, then you'll see that product being commercialized in Canada first. And we're not just exporting the intellectual capacity and then re-importing the product. So, creating the regulatory base for that, and then also having the broader structure to commercialization is important. But I think Krista, I saw that you were going to add there as well.
Yeah, I picked up on Ryan's comment, just the general comment that Canada doesn't always do a very good job commercializing innovation. And if we reflect on sort of the past 20 years with genetic engineering or GMOs, it's mainly been the larger field crops that have benefited from that type of innovation, right? Corn, canola, soy, cotton, and a few other exceptions. And one of the reasons for that is because of the cost of like the global regulatory environment and the cost of bringing a new genetically modified variety to the market. So smaller crops, it just hasn't made economic sense to develop those. So one of the opportunities of gene editing and CRISPR is for their use in smaller crops that maybe haven't had that opportunity to have innovation. And it's, if we think about researchers in universities who are maybe struggling for funding, the ability to do more with less if they choose to use these tools, that's one of the strengths of gene editing.
Okay, thank you. Heather, anything on your?
Yeah, I'll find that unmute button. Thank you. So maybe I'll just add onto Krista's point a little bit there about how it can be a burden to get through the regulatory system. And Canada is one part of a global regulatory system that you need to get through to bring something to market, right? So in my space, there's a few opportunities that we have. I just wanted to highlight that as well. One feature of our Canadian regulation is that it actually provides us with a lot of scope for flexibility around information requirements and using familiarity to accelerate decision making once we have seen a particular combination in a previous decision. So we're trying to take full advantage of that and set some good examples where we can of making information fit for purpose, not asking the nice to knows, but only asking the need to knows. What do we need to be able to reach a decision? We should be really having a very targeted approach to our regulatory system if we hope to bring that regulatory burden down. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I see a question that we have here, and it may be a good time to try and address it right now. And I think this is in a reference to a statement that Ryan had said about recalcitrant genetic systems. So essentially is if you can provide an example of a genetically recalcitrant system and how gene editing might allow their use and what outcomes might result.
Well, it depends on what you're trying to achieve, but typically microorganisms from lesser well-represented classes, like potentially actinomycetes, or working with archaea that have very interesting pathways. We've sort of been limited in the era of genomic sequencing at metagenomic sequencing, finding their genomes and putting the genes in somewhere else. But being able to tune a particular property that is already there in the strain, sort of like a enhanced metabolic engineering, right? We're using what's already there, but making it better, allows us to maybe overcome some of the problems. So for instance, in biofuels, the biomass utilization is a big factor. So we've tried to get around it by either taking a strain that works well and making it better at growing on biomass, or making a strain that grows well on biomass, but trying to make it better at manufacturing the product on the back end. And this has involved a brute force approaches, right? If we can use gene editing to essentially accelerate evolution along the lines of what metabolic engineering has achieved for amino acids and insulin, cheese renin, would allow us to essentially get to the strengths of the organism in the production in a particular application. And so it would also allow us to move beyond IP forts that are heavily localized on, let's say, E. coli or Saccharomyces, those genetic workhorses that arise and sort of create potential products, and would open up the playing space for a variety of potentially new organisms. So I think, again, these microorganisms that have proven very difficult to culture along traditional approaches could be enhanced for working in the lab moving ahead.
Okay, excellent. Any other comments from the panel on that question? Good. So I certainly know that from on a crop side of things, very often we may lack the genetic diversity for some traits, and gene editing certainly provides an excellent opportunity to sort of introduce that genetic diversity there for specific traits of interest. So that would be one example where we would sort of anticipate that we could use genomic or genome editing technologies. So maybe I'll move on to the next question that we have. I see there's a few questions popping up. I'll sort of try and sprinkle them in with some of the prepared questions that we had ahead of time. So the third question really looks at the future, right? And sort of how do we envision the future of gene editing as the technology evolves and mature? And I think that we've sort of touched upon this in some ways. We've had a bit of talking about what the potential is, but specifically, I know in terms of maybe Heather, we could start with you from a regulatory perspective. You mentioned earlier on, this aspect of as the new information comes in, you have to sort of put it into programs and put it into context. Are there any specific sort of areas of genome editing or gene editing, I should say, that you see sort of as really exciting coming down the road in the near future?
Well, I won't speculate too much on what the future holds, but maybe one thing I can say is that whatever breakthroughs might be coming our way, I think we can expect that they're likely going to be built on a foundation of what has already come forward, right? So, it's rare that you would see something that is truly so different from what you've seen in the past. And where that intersects with our regulatory system is that we actually do have that capacity right in the system, that we can build on past knowledge. So where a decision has already been made, that can form the foundation for that next innovation to just incrementally build. So that allows us lots of flexibility to, in some cases, state that those next products through the pipeline may qualify for an exemption, may qualify for a reduced information package referencing that past decision making. So whatever the future holds, I feel confident and optimistic that we are by and large ready for it. We do have a very future-proof framework here in Canada. So I'm not going to speculate too much. I'll leave that to the others on what might be coming. They'll know better than I do.
Okay.
I think that I can chime in on that, Pierre. I think there's a lot of really exciting stuff coming from the plant agriculture space. That's where I can comment with some comfort. But I might tie back into the regulatory space, because I think Heather's brought up a great point of if regulatory frameworks can be incredibly enabling for technology. It's an important element of bringing a technology forward, and having a regulatory framework that does have the ability to focus on where the risks actually are and ask for the data that's necessary, and make sure that the burden of that regulation is appropriate to ensure safety, because safety is the key there. But what I think is foundational about the consultations that are happening right now is it's providing the guidance about what does and doesn't need to come into that pre-market regulatory oversight framework. And that's really going to impact what the trends are toward what we see being developed. So it's really important that we get do you require a pre-market assessment or not right in these consultations, because that's what's going to set the framework for where people are more comfortable and where the cost of investment will be different in one place than the other. And an analogy that I like to use, and this kind of comes back to when we're thinking about our regulatory frameworks and the triggers, to think globally about how does this compare with the rest of the world. It's not just about gene editing, it's about conventional breeding, it's right across the board. Because if we look domestically and say, hey, well, we've reduced this barrier incredibly, like we only have a small hurdle now, it's very small, and that's a great thing. But if you look globally, and like an Olympic racer, there's 8 lanes in a 100-meter dash, and one lane has a 1-foot tall hurdle and the other lanes have none. Well, no one's picking the lane with the 1-foot tall hurdle, even though that hurdle is very small, because anywhere else you go, you wouldn't have a hurdle at all. So it's really important that we do strive to do better with what we have, but that we keep our heads up and looking at how are others achieving those same safety goals that we're looking for here. Through gene editing, what we see coming in the future, I think one of the most impactful, there's going to be a lot of really interesting consumer traits like non-browning products or things that consumers will look for, nutrient enhancement. I think those will be very interesting and niche market products. But I think one of the most foundational ones is going to be disease resistance. That's one of the hardest things to get with conventional breeding. That's the target of so many breeding programs. And the accessibility to gene editing will allow those existing targeted breeding objectives to be achieved in a more timely manner. Because as the climate changes, the diseases and the insect pressures that our crops are facing are accelerating. And for breeding to keep up with that, our plant breeders need the access to whatever tools are available for them. So I think it's not going to get a lot of fanfare in the Globe and Mail, but increasing, powdery mildew resistance by 10% in the next variety instead of by 3%, that's going to be a really big deal. And I think some of those are what's really going to make the difference.
Thanks. Krista, anything on your
Yes, thanks, Pierre. When thinking about the future of gene editing, my mind went to some of our grower organization members of the council and the more than 60,000 grain farmers who they represent, many of whom are facing one of the most serious droughts that they've seen in a lifetime. And drought is just one example of some of the challenges our sector is going to face in the future. We can also think about expanding pest ranges, soil salinity, more severe storms. And at the same time that those challenges may be arising, we're also asking our farmers to farm more sustainably on the land that they have available without more inputs. And to achieve that, we really need to have access to every tool in the toolbox. Gene editing might have a very critical role to play because it is a very efficient tool. So if we think about diseases, it's kind of an arms race where resistance needs to keep up with diseases as they evolve. And in some crops, new disease-resistant varieties are released every year. So if we have a regulatory system that discourages research or adds any undue delay to that process, that could place a burden on our sector in meeting some of those challenges of the future and in our ability to farm more sustainably.
Great, thanks. I'm seeing some questions come in that sort of are related to GMO. And so it may be a good point to introduce that the broader question that we have on GMO, and then get to some of those questions that people are posting. So the public perception of GMO foods has always been mixed. So are you observing or anticipating resistance from producers and consumers with the adoption of gene editing to agri-food? And what could be done to increase public trust for the technology? So Krista, maybe I'll start with you on this one.
Yeah, thanks, Pierre. I'll try to answer those questions and then touch on the public perception as well, because I think they are related, as you said. I think the questions there really demonstrate, why the CGC's policy on plant breeding innovation is that innovation and market access need to go hand in hand, because we're an exporting country. And if our markets won't buy the products we grow, that's not going to work. We won't be able to, our farmers won't be able to use those innovations if they wish. So situations like the triffid flax can arise when a product is approved and being grown in Canada before it's been approved in an export market. That gap in the timing of those approvals can cause significant trade disruptions and market closures, as was the case in 2009, I think. So is there hope that gene editing might be different and we might be facing a better situation? Yeah, I think that there absolutely is. Firstly, we're seeing regulators around the world like Japan, and even recently the EU, take steps to make sure that the approval process for gene edited products when there's no foreign DNA in the final product is not the same, not the same as the approval process for GMOs. So it might be faster and easier to have those approvals around the world to avoid the type of situation that would lead to another triffid flax. It's also, I think the sector learned a really hard lesson from that experience. And we've learned that a few lessons. Ian may want to touch on one or two. But one of those is the importance of early information sharing along the value chain and transparency about exactly what products are being grown in Canada. So we strongly support the voluntary transparency initiative that Health Canada included in its regulatory proposal. And we've been working for a while now on complementary private sector initiatives to make sure that we do have that good flow of communication. So the entire value chain knows and has a chance to discuss the market impacts before a new product is commercialized. And I don't have too much to add on public perception, except to say that, I think this distinction between plants that have foreign DNA in the final product and those that don't, that might be an important one for consumers. And there is that opportunity maybe to see more public acceptance for gene edited products because of that. And again, I'm very encouraged to see some of the dialogue and discussion, even in the European Union, where they're saying that, these gene edited plants are not the same as GMOs and should not be regulated the same way. Ian probably wants to add on that, though, I would suspect.
Yeah, I can jump in a little because with gene editing coming forward and the first potentially varieties that could make it to commercial production in Canada being not decades away but years away potentially. We've looked into, so where's the public at on this? What are we seeing? And a couple quick things that came from some polling that we had done was, without saying anything about gene editing, about 60% of the Canadian public just hadn't heard of it before, whether it's in the human space or the microbe space. And of course, coming from a scientific space, I assume everyone's heard about it because I read about it all the time. But no, people aren't, they have other things to do. So it was about 60% hadn't heard about it. But then before you explained what it was or what it could do, you just said, well, how would you feel about that word set related to your food? You saw about 35% of Canadians are saying, yeah, that sounds good. That sounds like you're moving things forward. And about 25% saying, I've got questions. I don't know what that is. So tell me more. And then 40% in the middle going, great question, but I'm busy. But I'm interested to learn more if I have time. So there's some folks that see a value of innovation. There's others that have questions, and then 40% in the middle. So what we've learned, like Krista said, is about early sharing of information is going to be really important. In the early days of the GMO discussion, companies that were working in that space, plant breeders working in that space, identified their customer as the farmer. And they said, well, that's our responsibility, is to communicate to the farmer how this works, why it's safe, how the regulatory system works. We'll talk to the farmer. Someone else will talk to the public. Well, we were wrong. And we didn't do a good enough job of speaking to the public. And that set us off down a bad road. So in this iteration, we're looking at, okay, people are going to have questions. This is a scientific issue. We found in other discussions, it's as people who've studied plant breeding, most people don't know that plants are bred. That's just not something, and that's not their fault. They just haven't studied agriculture. So it's not just about talking about gene editing. It's about bringing into light that there's a whole plant breeding system. And this is how varieties move forward, and this is how we move agriculture forward. So we got to do a better job of telling the whole story. And in support of that, like Krista said, the voluntary transparency initiative that Health Canada's proposed is a great way for industry to help disclose that information. And as well, we've launched a website called naturenurtured.ca. That's a website. You can also find us on LinkedIn and Twitter, if I do a little commercial for this activity. But it's a website where you can learn some of the basic scientific information about gene editing, some of the benefits that it provides, how it can help with sustainable agriculture and consumer concerns about the food system, and just give people a way to introduce themselves to this and not looking for someone else to do this for us. This is for the plant sector to do it. And I think what's exciting about that website, it's supported by 25 or 27 now agricultural organizations, which span the entire value chain from grower organizations to research granting institutions through to value chain and processing partners. So it's showing that the full breadth of the agriculture industry sees the potential of gene editing. And as Krista said, if you can't sell it, you can't grow it. But we definitely want to have the opportunity to grow it if we can sell it. So hence the importance of the regulatory framework being correct and inviting, and then also having the public engagement correct. We don't want to limit our opportunities with this product from not doing what we can do. And then the markets will be what the markets will be, and we'll be prepared for those when those demands arrive.
Okay, thank you. Any other sort of comments or any other points that the panel would like to make on GMO, comparing GMO with gene editing, or public perception on those?
If I can add a comment, I think I fully agree with Krista's comments on the nuances of foods where genetic material isn't present, or it's used as a processing aid or as a production system. It's important for the recognition of like a nature identical or the food product and the regulatory environment surrounding that be addressed. But I think the good news for GMOs or genetically modified organisms, or the foods coming out of them, is that there's strong tailwinds for other value systems, such as sustainability and addressing climate change, that are really sort of driving adoption of the technology forward, right? So in my previous job, we spent a lot of time building a food ingredient produced via fermentation. And there was a big fear that synthetic biology would be a major barrier to its implementation. And it's a constant discussion with regulatory, with investors, with your customers. But at the end of the day, it turned out that the food product was superior at a lower price. And therefore, that is what consumers wanted. And it really comes down to that sort of interface between belief and value. People might be anti-GMO until they need a biologic, and then it doesn't matter. So the interface, as I say, with where climate change is going, where our economy is going to play a big role in that. And I think that's where regulatory has to be a big component, right? That voluntary transparency initiative is a great step forward. We have to make sure that we're putting the information out there, but we're also putting out the right information. We don't want to inundate the every person with scientific data that is difficult to understand, or even worse, can create the wrong perception, right? So it's hitting that right balance between what people want to know, what they need to know, and presenting it in a way that they can actually absorb it and appreciate and act on it. And so along those lines, I think well-considered labeling laws are also going to be very important. Some of the stuff that can fall under natural flavors can be difficult to pin down sometimes. But without getting too wrapped up in the fads, right? I think just like different types of food components can become ascendant as healthy or unhealthy. You know, there's statements of I'm anti-GMO, or I'm currently anti-artificial or synthetic ingredients. And so making sure that we are addressing the underlying concerns and values of the Canadians and that need for transparency without creating systems of labeling that obfuscate what's important.
Thank you. And I think, Heather, you were also sort of raising your hand.
Sure, yeah, I'll jump in on this one because we are in the hot seat right now to a degree with our consultation underway. And I'll just mention that this is, of course, a highly politicized topic. It's something of interest, the degree to which the public is interested and the degree to which there's a perceived interest in the political aspects of this might not exactly align in fact, but we do have to walk a careful balance, I would say, in how we implement guidance, because it's really the reputation and credibility of the agency that is so important to our ability to deliver as a trusted regulator. So we have to behave in a manner where we preserve trust and the trust of the public. And there are a few aspects of that that are fairly important. So of course, we always strive to be neutral. We aren't promoting one technology over another. So to be unbiased in our decision making and avoid real or perceived conflicts of interest. So we certainly do get criticized around perhaps how much do we engage with industry, and are we giving a fair shake to other points of view, right? So there's also an aspect of we need to be very open to listening to the concerns of the public, of NGOs, and that's part of consultation, and to really listen. And at the end of the day, though, the decisions that we make have to be justified. So we do tend to come back to science as our guiding star on a lot of that, to have logical decision making. But hand in hand with making a decision is, as I think Ryan did a good job of articulating, is you need to be transparent about that, but also in a way that is accessible. And that is something that I would like to see us do perhaps a better job of, if I can criticize myself a little bit here, that we do tend to put out some perhaps overly technical language. It's a real art to be able to communicate effectively on science in a public way. So it's something that is always on our minds, is to maintain that trust, and transparency is huge.
Okay, good. Yeah, so maybe we can move on to the next question that we have here. I'm also monitoring the questions online that people are asking, and I think some of them fit in over here. So the critics of gene editing have said that the technology is imprecise and can have unexpected consequences. So what are the risks of using gene editing technology in agri-food? So we've gone through the panel once, sort of by starting. I don't know if I want to start with Ian again. I see it looks as though your screen is lighting up there, that you're sort of getting ready to talk. So maybe we'll start with you on this one.
Sure, I can take a first crack. I think with any new technology, people are going to have questions. I think and they should. That's, if people want to learn about something, they have to ask the question first. And I think what Ryan mentioned about understanding what people care about, what they're interested in, what their values are, is about how you're going to connect with them on these questions about, is it imprecise? Could it have risks and things of that nature? And also, as Ryan had mentioned, often people can get put into anti-camps. They're anti this or they're anti that. And I think the way that I try to look at it is nobody's really anti-GMO or anti-science or anti anything like that. They're pro something. They're pro environment. They're pro the health of their family. They've seen something that made them nervous, and they haven't been given good information to make them not be nervous. And that kind of links to Heather's, how do you put out technical science advice to plant breeders that also speaks to a large proportion of the population that may not know that plant breeding is even a profession. So you have to, it's not a fun place for the government to figure out how do we communicate both of these things in an accurate manner. So I think recognizing that people are concerned, they've seen something. I was thinking about this question on the way in, and I was like, I watched Interstellar the other night, and it got me really concerned again about the fabric of space-time and black holes. And it doesn't mean I'm anti-astrophysics. It just means I don't know much about astrophysics, and I haven't no one's provided me information that's easy to digest to make me understand a lot of these concepts. Someone else, an astrophysicist who learns about gene editing, if they didn't know there was plant breeding, they're going to equally wonder how this all works. So back to the specific question of gene editing being imprecise and does it bring risks? And I think that's what Health Canada reviewed the literature on very deeply, was, so how does this fit into plant breeding? So that's a framework that's existed for a long time, for hundreds and thousands of years, hundreds of years in its modern form since Mendelian genetics and understanding how plants move traits from one place to another. We know how much random variation there is in regular plant breeding. We know what gene editing does, which is incredibly less than that. It's very precise. It's targeted at what the plant breeder is looking to do. So that's where they came out with that statement that it is equally as safe as conventional breeding when used for those purposes. So, so that's what we have to communicate to those who have questions. And it's normal for people to hear of a new technology and have questions about how it's going to impact things that they care about.
Great. So what I'm hearing is that the technology, is precise, or at least as precise as the other methods there. And the key is the communication of the science that, the regulation is based on. So a few questions that don't necessarily deal specifically with the, the risks of the gene editing itself, but whenever I look online, seems to be a number of questions that sort of address more, other levels of gene editing, right? So I guess that one of the questions I see is how can we ensure that access to seeds that do not come from gene editing for producers that follow organic and are certified? So does a framework, is there sort of guidance that we can provide in this area?
So yeah, I can go first on that. I think as we've seen that, so the regulatory framework for pre-market assessment of new varieties that doesn't really play a role in that element. So just kind of as we talked about the regulations, that has not and would not play a role in ensuring the availability of any kind of certain seed. On the question itself of ensuring that there's a variety of seeds to choose from for the production system that suits the needs of that farmer, I think we've seen over the years with GM technology being very popular, that there remains ample seed supply for an organic market, which is growing on an annual basis. So seed companies will fill market demand where they exist. And if organic farmers are looking for organic seeds, those companies will supply those. And quite often, more often than not, it's the same company providing conventional seeds that are useful in organic varieties, and also providing other farmers seeds that have integrated GM or in the future gene edited traits. So seed companies are there to provide the seeds that are needed, and they will use the tools at their disposal to meet those market demands.
I'd like to add on to that by just acknowledging that Canadian grain exports are both, we export genetically modified grain and conventional grain and organic grain. And when we argue for access to innovation, it's about giving farmers choice and enabling their access to those innovative seed varieties to meet their goals and their production systems. I just want to add on here that when looking at the recent consultation that's launched, some of our concerns actually pertain to the impacts on conventional plant breeding rather than what's been proposed there for gene editing, because Canada is the only country in the world that in which a conventionally bred plant might require a GMO style pre-market safety assessment. And that is that's a concern that I think impacts all production systems and all farmers.
Okay, thanks. So you talked to Krista about trade and sort of export of things. One of the questions that we have here asks about how synchronous our regulations are with USA regulations, and I guess that brings up potentially a broader question in terms of what does gene editing mean in terms of international trade. So maybe what we can do is, for the specific question of how synchronous we are with the US, I thought maybe Heather, you could sort of take a first stab at this one, and Krista, perhaps you can afterwards talk about international trade as it relates to gene editing.
Sure, happy to. It gives me a chance to respond a little bit to the point Krista just raised about impacts on conventional breeding, because it's true that the Canadian framework is structured differently from other jurisdictions. And every jurisdiction has, of course, their own approach to regulation. Canada's has some unique features, and one of those unique features is that it is technology agnostic. And in consequence, certain products of conventional breeding have always been captured in Canada, and in the proposal that we've put forward will continue to be captured. And most often the kinds of things we're talking about there would be products of mutagenesis that have herbicide tolerance traits. That's pretty much the most common case that we see that is subject to Canada's regulatory framework, but exempted in other jurisdictions. And that falls in line with our principle of treating like things alike. So when there's a new herbicide tolerance introduced to a crop kind, that can have implications for our weediness pillar, and that is part of our regulation. So this is something that if there were to be an interest in changing that, it's nothing's off the table with us, but it will be a decision around what does Canada prioritize. Is it harmonization with other jurisdictions for economic reasons? Is it a science and consistency issue? There's a conversation that I think we have been having and need to continue to have there around how do we handle those products, and if what is the right solution, so that even where they are captured, can we take advantage of some of our existing flexibilities around information requirements to make those regulatory decisions as non-burdensome as possible. I recognize, Ian, that can still be a hurdle, even if it's a short one. But we're open to having that conversation. And again, as part of the consultation, I am looking forward to that feedback and hearing from industry and others on how can we improve our alignment. So that has been a focus as we have developed this updated guidance, is looking for opportunities to align with other jurisdictions, recognizing that we are operating under different frameworks, but we've tried to provide a little bit more alignment than what we've had in the past. We've introduced some parallel language to what the US is using. So we did look very heavily at the USDA's secure rule as we were developing our own guidance piece to see if there were some parallels that we can introduce, because we do recognize that where we can line up, that is an efficiency for the regulated parties.
Okay, thank you. Krista?
Thanks, Pierre. So to start off with the big picture, maybe it's stating the obvious for this audience, where every country around the world depends on international trade to a greater or lesser degree to meet their food security needs. And, we've seen in COVID-19, I think, the importance of keeping food supply chains open. I think Ryan touched on this earlier. So if we want to really realize the potential, the benefits that gene editing offers, whether that's tools to farm more sustainably, healthier products, reducing toxins in food, the list goes on, we need to make sure that we're not unnecessarily creating these market access challenges that could limit our ability to adopt innovation. So some markets like Canada, US, Japan, Australia, others are, many countries in South America are generally going in the same regulatory direction, and that's really good to see. But there are also some key markets for Canada that haven't yet quite finalized what their approach for gene editing will be. And at the end of the day, we likely will end up with a patchwork of requirements to some degree. So as an exporting country, how do we prepare for that? I think it really comes back to making sure that we have that early information sharing so that the entire value chain can understand when new products are ready to be commercialized in Canada, and to look at the market impacts and make sure that the approvals that are needed are in place. So, we've already touched on the Voluntary Transparency Initiative of Health Canada and others, but there are forums for discussion within each of the commodity associations around market access policies, et cetera, and product launch policies. So all of those, I think all of those tools will be important in making sure that we don't end up with those market disruptions that could limit our adoption of gene edited products.
Thanks. Yeah. One of the questions that we have here that's pertinent to the discussion right now has to do with whether Canada is falling behind other OECD countries with respect to GE in plants. So is that a fair question to ask? I mean, are we sort of staying on top of things, or because the regulatory systems are different in different countries, is it a fair question to be asking?
I think maybe I can take a shot. I think it's always a fair question to ask, and kind of comes back to that look globally and kind of try to benchmark yourself against what other countries are doing. But as Heather had mentioned, each country does have its own unique approach to something. So you're not attacking it the same way, but you're trying to see what the outcomes are. If I was to look at it my way, I would say in the last 4 or 5 years, we were starting to fall behind a couple countries who had revised their regulatory frameworks to be more clear. Where Canada has always been ahead is that we had a regulatory structure that was future-proof enough that we don't need massive regulatory change. We need a policy and guidance discussion. So we were ahead in one way, but we were falling a little bit behind in another. But as I opened with, we're really encouraged that the government is taking this on as a priority in all 3 sections, whether in health, environment, and feed, to look at what can be done to provide more clarity, which I think will put us, I'm very optimistic, will put us on par with the other countries when it's done. And then the forward-thinking approach to our regulatory structure will then mean if we're on par, we're actually ahead, because our regulations are ready for the next thing that's coming, so that it's a policy discussion and rather than a regulatory change. So it's fair question. I think functionally, from an innovation point of view, we were a little bit behind. We're in the process of catching up, and I think we'll be in a really good place when it's over.
Good. Anyone want to add to this?
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit. I think that's a really important point that Ian is making. In speaking with some of the researchers who develop new plant varieties in Canada, I've heard many examples over the past few years of challenges with the regulatory environment in Canada, to the extent that in some cases research moves out of the country. And we know that when research moves out of the country, the innovation that develops around that tends to follow as well. So that's just to underscore the point that Ian is making, that it is important that we look at our competitiveness and make sure that we're keeping up.
Okay. And in terms of, the, I guess the precise nature of the technology, and as well in terms of, keeping up with the regulatory framework, there is a question as well over here, sort of that indicates that, the on targets and off target sort of effects are currently sort of being discussed and looked into scientifically, to sort of come to a conclusion on that. But I think the question here is that Health Canada missed this discussion in its consultation document. Will it be hard for the CFIA adapt to new scientific findings if gene editing is exempt? Maybe Heather, that sounds like a question for you.
It does sound like that might be for me. So my understanding of that question, if I can try to read it back here a little bit, is about the discussion between on target and off target. And if there were to, sorry, maybe I'm not sure if I entirely understood the question here, but if there were to be perhaps some new information in the future that there was a risk that had been overlooked, would we be able to accommodate that? Was that the question?
Yeah, other people can maybe sort of put their interpretation, other than if the proponent of the question wants to, we can take her off mute and they can sort of provide clarification if they're interested in doing that.
Maybe I can chime in from an innovator point of view of how we view the policy when it comes to evolving scientific evidence as well. I think health thoroughly looked through the science. I think we've seen, and it's not just Health Canada, it's all those other countries, it's European Academy of Humanities and Sciences. There's a large number of groups that have done a look into this, and I think they've done it quite well. However, as an innovator, the regulator always holds the right, if new scientific evidence comes up, to amend, overrule, overwrite, recall. That's at the end of every GMO approval is the line, if any new evidence comes to light, then that it will be considered. So I think from a scientific, or how we look at it from an innovation point of view is, if any new science on something comes forward, the regulator always has the right to reconsider what it saw before. But I think what they did review was very thorough and supported by reviews that have been done by other governments and regulators around the world. So I think there's a pretty solid bank of evidence there.
And I see that Lucy has been unmuted. So Lucy, maybe you can clarify.
Great, thank you. I appreciate that. You can hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, yeah, it was this question of how the department could adapt as new scientific findings, if scientific findings are coming in, when there's a whole class of techniques that have been exempted from the regulations, especially with such new techniques. And especially because we actually did not see what, you know, Ian's referring to in terms of a rigorous scientific discussion in the consultation documents. So at such an early stage, how would that actually come to reality? You know, this idea of, okay, product by product, if in fact there is a great deal of promise in gene editing, that means a flood of new products, but they're all exempt, then what are the implications for the regulatory body? Thanks.
Okay, great. Thank you for that clarification. Yeah, so first I just wanted to correct one statement there that I know that we heard off the top of this meeting as well. It's not a blanket declaration that all products of gene editing would be exempt. There's a statement in certainly in the policy that CFIA has put forward that we expect that the vast majority of gene edited products would be exempt in terms of the impacts that they would be having on the environment. So that's the important asterisk right there. It's that we really, at the end of the day, are focused on the outcome on a product by product basis, not on exempting any technology as a whole, because as I said earlier, our system is technology agnostic. It's focused on outcomes. But to get to be able to make that statement that we expect that the vast majority of gene edited products would be exempt, we did have to undertake a very careful look at the science of gene editing and what is known about the current state of that science. And just as Health Canada did, we undertook quite a lot of work to reach that statement. So we have conducted literature reviews of what is out there in the scientific literature. We've also looked at the science-based policy documents that other countries have put out and the conclusions that they reached, and gave that consideration. Did we agree with that conclusion? Was it well supported? We held a multi-day series of panels with our AAFC scientists who work in plant breeding to understand how they use gene editing and all the other work that they do to bring a variety to market. So it's not, I think as Ian said earlier, the gene editing is a hammer, but there's a lot more that happens in that construction of a new variety, right? So we refer to this sometimes as the mass planticide of plant breeding, where there will be so many that fall on the discard heap as the breeder works towards that ultimate variety. There are rounds of back crossing to remove off target. There's the screening to look for quality parameters and off types and choose that elite line at the end of the day. So there's a lot of quality check that happens as part of the entire breeding cycle. We also attended a panel session that was hosted by Health Canada that involved external experts from, on the science of plant breeding, on the science of gene editing. And ultimately, the weight of that evidence is showing us that there are no special risks associated with gene editing. So we treat like products alike, regardless of how they're made. And at the end of the day, that's what informed that statement in our draft policy. So that's the work behind that, but it is out for consultation. So this is where we want to hear from others. If we have missed something, overlooked something, we're open to having that feedback come to our attention so that we can consider that and review it as part of the decision making to finalize a policy.
Okay, thank you. I think there's two questions that we still have on the board here, but I do see also that we're getting close to the end of our session. So I thought maybe we can address the question maybe quickly on whether gene editing is going to create new value-added sort of opportunities for royalty collection in the seed through licensing of technologies. I mean, I'm thinking Ian or Krista. Or maybe not.
Who's gonna go? Who wants to go first, Krista?
Ian, I think that's a question for you.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm there's two ways I can look at that question. One is, new opportunities for maybe smaller startup companies to innovate and create an engine for more innovation. Like, can a smaller company get in the game and start in creating innovation and then selling that and reaping the rewards so they can create new varieties and keep that moving? So it could be a question about, does this create opportunity for more entrants into the marketplace? For that, I think yes. The other question could be, does this create more concerns around intellectual property protection and elements in that space? And I think that comes back to this discussion about plant breeding at large, where whether it's a patent on a GM seed or plant breeders' rights on any other type of seed, new varieties coming forward from plant breeders are commonly and routinely put under a level of intellectual property protection so that that innovator can continue to innovate. So that's true whether it's a public breeder or a university breeder or a private breeder. So I don't see gene editing changing the existing landscape of how the innovation cycle works for companies and breeders who are funding their programs through the sale of the varieties that they create. That would be my two ways that question could be asked, and my two answers. Hopefully one of those two was what the person was looking for.
Hey, thanks a lot, Ian. So maybe before I throw this back to Serge, I'd like to basically just invite any of the panel members, if there's, now that you have this very attentive audience on the call, if there were any specific elements of gene editing that you would like to communicate that didn't come through as part of the questions, maybe you have a minute or two to quickly speak about this. Ryan, maybe I'll start with you. I think the last few questions that we have been more on the regulatory side, so maybe hadn't involved you, and so maybe a good opportunity to sort of make sure that you haven't lost your voice.
Well, I think I comment on the just statement about IP, and then before that, the sort of harmonization of regulation. I think the other component of harmonization is the harmonization of intellectual property policy. As we're expanding into these markets, we have to make sure that we are aligning well on those protection terms moving ahead. And I think from a research perspective, we can embrace where the technology is going. There's still so much potential. We're still in the infancy as precision improves, but also as scope of the nature of the modifications that are made possible with gene editing continue to advance. We're also going to see other applications, right? We're seeing genetically engineered mosquitoes being released into the environment. We're discussing gene drive release into the environment. And so as we start working at the interface of gene edited plant with a gene edited microbiome to tolerate a particular environment, that nature of release into the environment of these complementary ecosystem modifying organisms is going to be important to address scientifically as well as regulatory and policy wise. So we're just scratching the surface of what gene editing is going to make possible. Like, we haven't even gone near human germline modification, which there's a whole bag there waiting to be explored as well.
Okay, excellent. Heather, from your perspective, any final words?
Sure. Yeah, I'll just make a plug here that I think we have a really unique opportunity in plant with gene editing, in the sense that because of the nature of plant breeding, there's so much opportunity to select lines that are very well adapted and suited, and discard, as I said earlier, the ones that are not quite meeting the bar in terms of quality or the exact edit that you were going for. So there's good reason that this is really, I think, one of the earlier targets for updated guidance around gene editing. But I'm aware that there also needs to be conversations about other foods. So Ryan's been pointing out microbes and animals as well. It's it's a different ball game for perhaps some of those considerations. And fertilizer could be another one where you might have soil microbes that there's some opportunity there for nutrient use efficiency. So whatever policies we put in place for plant, we're trying to keep that in our mind as well, of that there are other regulatory authorities around those other organisms that they'll need to follow along eventually as well with their own guidance, so that people working with animals, microbes, and so on will also be able to use the technology safely and sustainably. Thank you.
Thank you. Krista?
Thanks, Pierre. I think the only point I'd like to add is in relation to safety, and just to say that Canada depends on our reputation as a reliable supplier of safe and high quality grain. And we certainly wouldn't support any regulatory changes that would call into question the safety of the Canadian grain supply or our agricultural exports. And I take great comfort knowing that Health Canada worked with a scientific panel, just as the government of Japan did, just as we've seen academic experts and government officials and bodies in the EU come out with the really clear statement that gene editing is just as safe as conventional plant breeding. So I think it's important that we distinguish between healthy scientific dialogue going forward and concerns that are perhaps unfounded. Thanks.
Thank you. And Ian, we started with you. Maybe we'll finish with you.
Yeah, and I think I would echo what Chris said. Coming back to safety, I think is really important. Given that plant breeding inherently is such a historically safe endeavor, we often skip over that discussion because those who work in the space know that discussion was implicitly held prior to talking about the regulatory framework. But coming back to that safety is always the underpinning of a regulatory policy approach, and that doesn't change. But knowing that we're moving forward, this is a really exciting time to set this policy framework for the next 25 years. Like, this is 1996, the first major review since. So it held up pretty good for 25 years. That's a long time for a regulatory policy. And the work that we're doing now can set us up for the next 25. And I think that's really exciting. But as was mentioned in some of the other questions, that has to come with a responsibility of the industry and the plant breeders who are working in this space to figure out how to talk to the public about what they're interested in, provide that information, be transparent about not just gene editing, but plant breeding at large, because that is such a big focus of this policy moment. Is gene editing is getting the headlines, but as we mentioned, the majority of gene editing and the majority of conventional breeding will not require a pre-market assessment, and making sure that we're really clear about when it does, so that it doesn't create any additional burden in Canada that we're seeing in other countries who are reaching those same safety outcomes. So really excited to see the government priority on this and for the next steps as we move forward.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we had lost Serge, but he's back on now. At least I think he is. So before I throw it over to Serge, I wanted to thank all the panelists and the attendees for their questions and for their attention. It's been a pleasure to participate. Serge? Maybe he can't hear us. Christine, do you know if Serge is online?
He did lose connection and he's trying to get back in actually. But let me just.
Okay, maybe we'll see if we can give him a second or so. There, I
There he
can.
is.
We have video now of you, Serge. So I'll give you the last word, and we lost him again. Oh no, there he is. He's moving on my screen. He's playing musical chairs.
There you go. He's on his phone now. Yeah, no. All right.
Okay, so so I guess Christine, did you want to say a few final words, or do we wait for Serge to come back?
You can actually just go ahead on his behalf. You have that on the notes.
Yeah. Okay. Great.
Yeah.
So as I already indicated, I'd like to thank the panelists and the attendees for today, and really the last word is to invite everyone to the 5th webinar, which will be held or scheduled for August 26th. And the topic of that discussion will be trust in science, agri-food innovation in the face of decreasing public confidence. Thank you, everyone. And I hope that you have a good end of the day. And I look forward to seeing everyone at the next webinar.